It is such an honor to be here with you. I've been following this church from afar, and it's been so exciting just to see what God is doing. And however long or short you have in your time in Seoul, I mean, wouldn't it be amazing just to be part of a story of what God was doing, birthing something new, such as this church? And so I just want to applaud. And if you're new here, just want you to know I am a guest. So whatever I have to say today, if you don't like what I have to say, the guy next week will be way better. That's Jiwon. And meanwhile, if you do like what I have to say, guess what? The guy next week will be way better, so come back next week. Either way, come back next week. It is a real honor to be here. And, you know, this passage that was read for us is from the Psalms. And the Psalms are basically the Judeo-Christian songbook. So in other words, these are the prayers that have been sung and prayed in ancient times for many generations over many years. And this passage in particular is one that has so struck me throughout my life. And one of the reasons why is because it describes someone's relationship with God in such a profound way, about the way that when someone prays, and the psalmist, as he writes about a God who has searched me and knows me so deeply. And for someone like me, that is something that was so foreign to kind of my belief, because I often felt like an outsider who no one really cared to get to know. And yet, check this out. Look at what it says in the beginning of this psalm. It says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways." Now, isn't that stunning? It's this vision that God somehow knows us each so deeply, better than perhaps we might know ourselves. One of the images that we use often when it comes to discipleship, and even just when it comes to our own humanity, is actually this image. It's an image of an iceberg. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the image of an iceberg, 10% of an iceberg is actually above the surface, and yet 90% is actually below the surface. Now, in many ways, an iceberg I think it's an apt description of how many of us move about, especially in our social media, digital world that is so saturated with just this veneer of an appearance, where we can easily craft or curate this online persona that's so different than who we are. And yet in this psalm, we've got this picture, this vision of a God who knows not just the 10% that everyone else sees, but the 90% below the surface. Like I mentioned, I think in my own life, growing up, I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and I currently live in New York. We've lived in New York for 23 years now. However, growing up in Los Angeles, in a neighborhood that wasn't full of a lot of other Korean Americans, I got bullied a lot, was constantly kind of the recipient of racist taunts. And so as a result, just growing up as somewhat of a minority who felt so much like an outsider in the world. And throughout kind of my growing up years then, there was always this longing to somehow be known. But there was this feeling that no one truly knew me. They only knew this caricature of me, or they knew how to kind of make fun of me, or things like that. And so as a result, there's constantly been this longing. Is there anyone that really, truly knows me? Not only that, I actually grew up with 3 brothers, so there's 4 of us. And with each of my brothers, I love my brothers. We have a great relationship. And my oldest brother, of course, my brother Stefan, he was like the oldest brother, the biggest, the strongest, and all that good stuff. And then my second brother, my brother Philip, he was always the smart one. He got straight A's, and I hated him. No, I'm just kidding, I didn't hate him. I love my brother. But nonetheless, I was so jealous of him. He was always this person who got good grades and was destined for greatness in whatever he was going to do. And then my third brother is actually my twin brother. So my twin brother Peter and I, even with in little pictures, I remember showing actually my kids these pictures of me when I was a little kid. And I'd be in these pictures with my twin brother Peter. And Peter was so handsome. And I'm just kidding. Yeah, sort of. But that's my twin brother. And he and I would be in these pictures together. But my brother Peter was always this gregarious leader, someone who was super winsome. And he'd always be making some sort of gesture in these pictures of us growing up. It'd be kind of like a gesture of him making like some sort of face. And usually in these pictures that I was showing my children, I'd be kind of in the background, and I'd be kind of laughing at my brother, just kind of behind him, in the periphery, laughing at him. And as I was showing that to my children, and as I was reflecting on my own life, I think it was just such a description of how I kind of felt growing up, kind of on the outside, not distinct amongst any of my brothers, longing and hoping and wishing that somehow someone truly knew me. So you can imagine how stunning this passage is, though, when the invitation of this passage is actually an invitation to see a God who actually knows the 90% below the surface. You know, I think oftentimes, even in religious settings, it's so easy to walk in with our Sunday best and to just have this, again, this manicured image, and yet each one of us, the 90% below the surface, there are longings, there are hopes, there's shame that some of us carry, there's woundedness, there's depression, there's addiction, there's all sorts of these things that we carry. And there's something so reassuring that the psalmist basically is talking about a God who knows all things and actually sees us beyond the ways that people even see us, beyond even the ways that we might even see ourselves. Now, one of the stunning things about this psalm, though, right, because it talks about in all these falutant ways about the way that God searches us and he knows us and he sees us. But then, did you notice there was that moment in the psalm when all of a sudden, it churns all of a sudden, and the psalmist is basically like, oh, God, my enemies, may they perish. And I hate those who hate you. And please, will you hate them and smite them too? That's just basically a translation, my modern translation of what he was saying. It's like he says all these beautiful theological words about about what God is like and how God knows us. And then all of a sudden it moves into this moment of like, God, I hate these people. And will you do something to my enemies? You know, one of the things I love about the Psalms is just how honest they are. Because isn't that often what our prayer life is like sometimes? Or maybe just mine, I don't know. But it's basically this kind of waffling between, again, praise to all of a sudden my enemies. And then look at how the psalm ends. Check it out. He ends, after he goes into this diatribe against his enemies and how he's full of rage and hate. He says to God, he says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Do you see the movement of what just happened? All of a sudden, he's saddled with his own guilt and shame, and the psalmist now points and says, God, would you actually do the work? I know that you have searched me and you know me, but will you actually do the further work of investigating the deepest caverns of my soul? Will you do the work of looking at every moment and sense of darkness that lies within me? And would you lead me in the everlasting way? It's like this prayer of confession is given at the end of this psalm. Because the psalm, again, it starts out so glowing, and then there's this darkness, and then there's this, God, would you search me? And if there's any way in me that's offensive to you, will you lead me in the everlasting way? In other words, here's what the psalmist is basically saying. God, will you do the work of shedding light in the areas of my soul that you need to shed light on? And will you help me to grow in a certain kind of awareness of myself, especially in the ways in which I am not living according to the everlasting way? In other words, it's basically an invitation towards deeper levels of self-awareness. Now, the problem with it is that most of us, when it comes down to self-awareness, I once read this study that was done that said that 95% of people think they're in the top 1% of self-awareness. I know most of you are thinking right now, yep, I'm in that 1%. That's exactly the point. I mean, this is what we think. We think of ourselves as being super self-aware. I'd love to show this diagram, and it actually comes from a diagram that was developed in 1955 by Joseph and Harrington Ingham, Joseph Hart, I believe, and Harrington Ingham. And that's why it's called the Johari window. It's named after their names. Now, if you notice basically in this chart, and today in group therapy sessions, this chart is often used to investigate what we know about ourselves and how we can actually grow in this aim of self-awareness. Now, if you notice in the top left corner, that's the area that's open, the area that's known to myself as well as known to others. That's the open area. Now notice if you go to the right, there's this area called the blind spot. Now the blind spot that each one of us have and that every single one of us carry, it's unknown to me, but it's known to everyone else. Now every single one of us, because we are all finite human beings, we all have blind spots. Now meanwhile, in the bottom left corner, there's this area that's hidden. And if you notice, the hidden part is the part that's known to me, but unknown to everyone else. Those are like the secret shame, the addictions, maybe the wishes, the hopes, the dreams that I wouldn't share with anyone. And then, of course, there's this purple section in the bottom right. That's the unknown quadrant. Now, that unknown quadrant, only God knows, because that's unknown to me as well as unknown to others. Now, one of the tasks of the Johari window, the invitations, is that for us to grow in deeper self-awareness and maturity, it means that to get into my blind spots, I need to begin to ask other people about what are some of my blind spots. I need to ask for feedback. Meanwhile, in ways in which I'm supposed to press down my open area and actually grow in confessing the areas of myself that are hidden, I need to grow in becoming someone who's confessing, disclosing to others what I'm struggling with appropriate others. Now, this task of self-awareness is for all of us. Why? Because like I said, most of us, we are not saying, God, search me and know me. We just think we know the best about ourselves. I know this is so true for me. A few months ago, my wife and I, we were actually looking at a picture, and the picture was from a party that we had attended. And at this party, it was kind of like the picture was taken from a balcony, so it had this kind of downward picture that was taken, and people were there. And so as we're talking, I was like, I knew that we were at this party. I'm like, oh, Tina, who's that guy right there? And she kind of gasped a little bit, and she's like, that's you. And I was like, no, that's not me. That guy's bald. And she goes, she gasped again. She's like, Drew, you're bald. And I was like, no, I got more hair than that. I can feel it on my head. And she's like, no, that's what you look like. So then all of a sudden she calls over my daughter. She's like, Avery, come on over here. Avery comes over, right? She bounds over. She's like, Avery, who's that in the picture? She goes, Appa! And then she runs off. And then it just became so clear that I'm bald. So I went to the mirror and I just kind of looked at myself in the mirror. And then I just put my head down like this, and I realized I never do that. I never look at the top of my head. And it just dawned on me, I'm really bald. I'm really bald. And then I looked at myself, I'm like, you're bald. I mean, it was this moment of just self-realization that, wow, this is the way that I exist in the world around me, and I had no idea. I mean, isn't this true though, right? Have you ever watched yourself playing basketball or playing sports or something? Now you gotta understand, I watch the NBA, so I love watching professional basketball. And so I remember the first time I watched myself play basketball, and I was so stunned. I'm like, I am so small, and I'm so slow. And I walk a lot. That was the most stunning thing, because oftentimes when I think of myself playing basketball, I think of myself as spry and ready to cat quick or whatever. And watching myself, I'm like, oh my goodness, I am so small and slow and tired and bald. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't notice my baldness back then. But it's amazing, right, that there's so many things that we're unaware of. And yet the invitation of God, especially in this psalm, is that each one of us would actually have a posture before the God who knows all things, that even still we would actually say, God, would you search me? And if there's anything in me that you want me to grow in my own self-awareness, especially the ways that might be offensive to you, would you please search me and lead me in a new way? Now, it could be anything from how we look or how we're perceived when playing sports or something. But the essence of it is, it gets at again, the dark places in our lives. God, if there's anything offensive, what are those parts of me that are hurtful, that are prideful, that are lusting, that are perverse? What are those things? God, would you do the work of flashing a light on my soul and uncovering the areas of darkness that I could come correct before you? Now, this posture of humility, of confession, and wanting God to actually meet us in these moments is one of the most stunning invitations of being a Christian, right? Because so much of the world is not saying, hey, notice more deeply your flaws and come before God. And yet, here's what the psalmist is doing, saying, God, if there's any offensive way in me, anything where I have sinned in word, thought, or deed, against you or others or even against myself, would you lead me in the everlasting way? Now, I recognize immediately, right, even as I'm talking about this, some of us are recoiling because we're like, oh, seriously, Drew? This is what we're going to talk about? I knew it. I knew that all we were going to do is you were going to come to church, I was going to come to church, and someone was going to talk to me about feeling more ashamed about myself. I know it's so easy to kind of come to religious settings like this and be like, that's what people do. They just shame me. You're not a good enough this. You're not a good enough that. And in many ways, especially in a culture like this country, which is so significant about critique and self-critique, it's so easy to do this, to be caught in this cycle of shame. And some of you are like, I can't believe it. Even the church, of course, the church is the place where you're going to shame me into all the ways that I've messed up. But did you notice that actually this passage wasn't simply about this kind of posture of confession? There was a whole other part of this psalm. Check out what it says in this psalm. Most of the psalm says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." See, most of the psalm was speaking about a God who has created us and that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. High five your neighbor and say, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. High five your other neighbor and say, you are too. See, some people think that the Christian message, that somehow faith is about just continually shaming us into this place of being pushed down and leveled. And yet throughout this psalm, it also presents this other way that we are to see ourselves. That we're actually invited to be a people who are able to acknowledge with bravado and with confidence that you and I are fearfully and wonderfully made. And in many ways, the psalmist holds together both of these realities. The reality that on one hand, hopefully you and I, that we are people before God who say, God, any offensive way in me, lead me in the everlasting way. And at the same time, to be a people who can stand before others and say, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, the reality is, each one of us, though, we tend to fall into one extreme or the other. One extreme of a people who are consistently debasing ourselves. I know this has been the story of my own life. Again, I grew up as the youngest of four, constantly aware of the ways that I didn't measure up. And so as a result, it's so easy for me to be self-condemning, to be self-critical of myself. Meanwhile, there are others of us who maybe it's not self-critique that's our problem. Maybe our problem is we tend to be too puffed up in the way that we think of ourselves. And we talk about, yes, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I need to hear that and tell myself that all the time. And I don't have any issues. I'm a perfect person. But do you see how both of those extremes are both extremes? They don't get to the reality of what we are like as human beings. Because as human beings, what the psalmist is saying is that each one of us are people who have both light and darkness. We are people who, yes, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and yet at the same time, we are people who say, God, if there's any offensive way in me, would you lead me in the everlasting way? Now, like I mentioned, I think especially in a place like South Korea, this culture is awash in criticism, in self-critique, in shame. And it's so easy to really see ourselves as being fearfully and wonderfully made because we're constantly told how we don't measure up. We're not smart enough. We're not pretty enough. We're not whatever else it might be enough. There was actually this campaign that was done by Dove, the beauty brand, and there are these things called beauty sketches that were created. And it's these sketches in which they wanted to give people an insight into often how we can become our own worst critics towards ourselves. And I thought it'd be helpful for us to actually play this video now so that we could watch for ourselves.
So I'm a forensic artist, worked for the San Jose Police Department from 1995 to 2011.
I showed up to a place I'd never been, and there was a guy with a drafting board.
We couldn't see them, they couldn't see us.
Tell me about your hair.
I didn't know what he was doing, but then I could tell after several questions that he was drawing me.
Tell me about your chin.
It kind of protrudes a little bit, especially when I smile.
Your jaw.
My mom told me I had a big jaw.
What would be your most prominent feature?
Kind of have a fat, rounder face.
The older I've gotten, the more freckles I've gotten.
I would say I have a pretty big forehead.
Once I get a sketch, I say thank you very much, and then they leave. I don't see them.
All I had been told before the sketch was to get friendly with this other woman, Chloe.
Today I'm going to ask you some questions about a person you met earlier, and I'm going to ask you some general questions about their face.
She was thin, so you could see her cheekbones. And her chin, it was a nice, thin chin.
She had nice eyes. They lit up when she spoke.
Cute nose.
She had blue eyes, very nice blue eyes.
So here we are. This is the sketch that you helped me create, and that's a sketch that somebody described of you.
So yeah, that's...
She looks closed off and fatter, sadder too. The second one looks more open, friendly, and happy.
I should be more grateful of my natural beauty. It impacts the choices and the friends that we make, the jobs we apply for, how we treat our children. It impacts everything. It couldn't be more critical to your happiness.
Do you think you're more beautiful than you say?
Yeah.
We spend a lot of time as women analyzing and trying to fix the things that aren't quite right. And we should spend more time appreciating the things that we do like.
You are more beautiful than you think. High five your neighbor and say, you are more beautiful than you think. High five your other neighbor and say, you are too. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. The psalmist is able to say these words as a prayer of this is God's thoughts of us, is that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. That you and I are more beautiful than we think. So how do we navigate the world then, right? Because if both of these realities are true, the reality that, yes, I'm more beautiful than I think, that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made, and yet at the same time, the psalmist ends with God, would you search me? And I know that there's darkness within me. If there's any offensive way in me, would you lead me in the everlasting way? Then what do we do? How do we navigate and hold together and integrate both of these realities? Now, when it comes down to it, see, there's different ways that society has taught us to think about our own identities. And a generality is essentially that there's two different ways that society often teaches us to find or derive our own sense of self-worth. And it comes really from either traditional cultures or modern cultures. Now, traditional cultures, I grew up as a Korean American, born and raised in Los Angeles. And for so much of my life, my parents would tell me, your last name means more than your first name. Hyun, that's the name. You bring honor and shame to the Hyun name. That's why you have to get into Harvard. And I didn't. But like so much of my identity then was found in these traditional cultures on like bringing honor to that name. In other words, my sense of self-worth and identity was found in what other people thought of me, especially my family. That's how traditional cultures tend to think of things. Now, meanwhile, modern cultures tend to emphasize the self. Oh, it's not what people think of you. It's just that you self-actualize, that inside you derive enough horsepower within yourself to believe in yourself and to believe that you are more beautiful than you think. Now, see, isn't this the problem, though? That in both of these different paradigms, one paradigm says you are defined by what other people think about you, and you shouldn't bring shame upon your own family and this culture and this community and this country that you're from. And there's this other viewpoint, though. It's like, oh, no. You're supposed to get enough sense of self from your own internal fortitude. And the reality is both of those things are so capricious, aren't they? Why? Because traditional cultures, people's opinions of me, they fluctuate all the time. Meanwhile, my own opinion of myself fluctuates all the time. So what is it then? How in the world do I navigate in a world where I can actually integrate both of these realities? Where do I find the truest, most secure type of identity to live in a world that's so kind of capricious in the way that it defines me? Well, see, the Christian story has always been not about finding your sense of self-worth from your culture, your family, nor has it been about finding it just from yourself and deriving just enough internal kind of smarts to do it. It's always been about finding our truest identity, not in ourselves, not in other people, but in the God of heaven and earth who sees us. And we see this God who sees us. Notice this psalm. Look at what it says. It says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around you, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day. The darkness is as light to you. For you, God, created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them." See, the Christian way of navigating the world is finding our truest sense of identity, not from ourselves and not from other people, but from the God of heaven and earth who sees you, your light and your darkness. And you know what's so amazing is that Jesus comes into the world, and it says, God demonstrates his love for us in this. You and I are fearfully and wonderfully made, and yet we are also sinners who are deserving of death. But God demonstrates his love for us in this. While you and I were still sinners, Christ dies for us. That if you were ever wondering what God's opinion of you might be, you need not look further than look to the cross where Jesus would give his very life for you and for me to show you that his posture towards you, that his opinion of you, that when you feel like you're going so low that you're caught in this cycle of depression or whatever it might be, or you're caught in this cycle of pride and becoming so self-inflated, that the good news of the gospel has always been, it's not based on your performance, what you think about yourself, what your family thinks about you, what social media might say about you, how many followers you have in these different arenas or digital platforms, but your truest sense of identity and security and comfort and hope and love is found in a God who would die for you, who loves you enough that he would give his life for you. The question for me and for you is, where have you and I been chasing for whatever that elusive sense of being good enough, for being lovable enough? Is it from these outside people? Is it from how our career is going? Or is it from the one who would give his life for you, who says that no matter what your station in life, that he is a God who is for you and loves you, and that you can find your deepest security in God in such a manner that you could even say, God, would you search me and know me? And if there's any offensive way, that you could do so without any kind of self-hatred or self-loathing, but instead with an openness to God. Or that you could also be someone who says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made, and to do so from a quiet and firm and resolute confidence that comes from knowing that there's a God of heaven and earth who sees you and I as beautiful. Where are you finding your sense of identity? What's in your iceberg today? What's that 90%? Is it the loneliness perhaps that you're feeling, the anxiety that you've been going through? And what if the word for you today was from the God of heaven and earth who has come to tell you today, of all the places that you could be in the world, to tell you today that he's a God who is for you and loves you. He would give his life for you, that he sees you as valuable and as more beautiful than you might even know yourself. I'd like to invite us, if we could stand together and the worship team come forward. I would love to just invite us. Would you just close your eyes with me? And, whatever you've walked in here with, in a city as massive as Seoul, it's so easy to be lost in the crowd and to be caught in cycles of loneliness and feelings of like, gosh, is there anyone that truly knows me or can perhaps help carry the things that I'm going through right now? And here's what I would love to do. I'd love to invite us first. Just if you are so willing, if you could just kind of open your hands in a posture of receiving before God. And I would just love for us just right now to reflect on a God that whatever you came into this room with, whatever you've been carrying, the God of heaven and earth, he sees you and he knows you. The word that keeps coming to mind right now is the word home. And I realize that's part of why Ark was created as a church community, to be a home for those along the way. To be a place where we don't have to put up our pretenses, but instead we could just be ourselves. And so I just want to pray this over us. If your hands are open, God, I pray that you would burn into our hearts a sense of calling and identity and security that comes from knowing you. Some of us are saddled with shame over the ways perhaps that we've parented or done relationships. Some of us are carrying just the pangs of loneliness or an addiction that we've fallen into that it's just so hard to kick. And today, God, we just want to come correct before you and say, God, before you, we want to be found by you. We want to be seen by you. And we want to find a home in you. So, Father, I pray that you would burn a blazing sense of your spirit into the hearts of each person that's here. And God, that we would be a people who can become a home for one another in you. We love you and we thank you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.